Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. The arrival of the first contact. Sergeant Elias Holt had been briefed on the Altheans before he arrived, but nothing in the reports could have prepared him for this. The sheer magnitude of their presence, both physical and cultural, was overwhelming. He had expected a formality, an uncomfortable but necessary interaction. Instead, he found himself a part of their world, an unwilling participant in their strange customs. As he lay in the large bed that first night, the vastness of the alien room pressing in around him, Holt couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation. The stone walls, lined with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light, seemed to mock him. He was an outsider, an intruder in a world that had no room for modesty, no place for the careful boundaries he'd grown up with. Viria, the Althean ambassador, had explained their customs matter-of-factly before he'd arrived. To share a space with another is a sign of respect and understanding, she'd said in her deep, soothing voice. A bond is formed, a trust between individuals. We cannot progress without trust. But Holt didn't trust them. He trusted the mission, the uniform he wore, the future of humanity. He had no interest in forming bonds with the very species they were negotiating with, especially not under these circumstances. The whole thing felt like a test he wasn't sure he was passing. He shifted in the bed, hoping for sleep, but his body refused to cooperate. Viria's aides, Nissa and Lyria, lay just a few feet away, their presence palpable despite the distance. Holt could feel the heat radiating off them, their movements fluid and purposeful as they adjusted their positions. His gaze flickered to them, the way their tall, lithe forms seemed to take up so much space. Even in their sleep, they seemed alert, ready for anything. It was as though the very act of being in the same room with them made him feel smaller. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice from the shadows. "Are you uncomfortable, human?" Viria's voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was no mistaking the amusement in it. Holt tensed. "I'm fine," he muttered, not entirely sure if that was true. Viria didn't seem convinced. "You humans are strange. You keep your distance as if proximity is something to fear." She shifted in the bed, the movement of her long, toned body stirring the air. "Is it not true that you desire intimacy despite pretending otherwise?" Holt didn't respond. He didn't want to. The very concept of intimacy felt foreign in this context, and he wasn't about to engage in a discussion about human desires with an alien who seemed far too comfortable with the idea. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, before Viria spoke again. "Perhaps you should rest," she said. "Tomorrow we will begin the negotiations in earnest. There will be little time for idle thoughts." Holt grunted, turning over and trying to force his mind into a state of calm. The bed, however, was too large, too alien, and he felt too exposed. The covers shifted again, and he felt the weight of Viria's presence near him. She hadn't moved too close, at least not physically, but her energy seemed to surround him, pressing in from all sides. "Sleep well, Sergeant Holt," Viria said, her voice lingering in the air like a soft melody. "Tomorrow will be an interesting day." The next morning came too quickly. Holt awoke to the soft rustle of movement around him. Viria, Nissa, and Lyria had already risen, their tall frames silhouetted against the soft glow of the room's light sources. The window in the corner of the room revealed a glimpse of the Althean capital, gleaming, monolithic structures rising from the desolate landscape, the city built on an alien understanding of beauty and functionality. Holt was still trying to wrap his head around the reality of his situation when Viria approached him, her steps silent but purposeful. "It is time to begin," she said, her voice carrying a note of authority that cut through the haze of his thoughts. "Come. You are expected at the council chambers?" He nodded, swallowing the knot in his throat. There was no going back now. Viria led him down a long hallway, the walls lined with intricate carvings and holographic projections of ancient Althean history. Holt tried to keep his focus on the task ahead, but his mind kept wandering back to the night before, back to the strange feeling of being watched, the almost electric charge in the air whenever one of the Altheans was near him. He was acutely aware of his own awkwardness, the discomfort of being thrust into their world without warning. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was a pawn in a game he didn't understand, that the stakes were far higher than anyone had let on. The council chambers were a stark contrast to the rest of the embassy, a cold, sterile room dominated by a massive holographic display of the Althean homeworld. The atmosphere was tense as Holt entered, his eyes scanning the room. Sitting at a long obsidian table were the leaders of the Althean political system, towering figures with eyes that gleamed with intelligence and calculation. Varia took her place at the head of the table, her presence commanding the room. As Holt took his seat, he felt the weight of their gazes upon him. The silence stretched before him, heavy with unspoken expectations. This was not a simple diplomatic meeting. This was a test of will, a trial where human pride and Althean arrogance would collide. Finally Varia spoke, her voice smooth and unyielding. "We are here to discuss the future of our two species, Sergeant Holt," she said. "But let us first understand what it means to trust each other." Holt straightened in his chair. He had known this would be difficult, but the cold intensity of their scrutiny made his pulse quicken. He nodded, trying to appear confident. "I'm here to ensure the safety and success of humanity's relationship with the Althean people." Varia smiled faintly. "That, Sergeant, is where we begin." But as the meeting unfolded, Holt couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at play, something hidden beneath the surface of their words. Something he was about to discover the hard way. And when the conversation turned toward the specifics of their alliance, Varia's eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him question everything. Clash of cultures ****. The air inside the Althean Council chambers was thick with tension, but Sergeant Elias Holt couldn't help but feel a certain sense of awe. The room was vast, its walls covered in intricate designs that pulsed with faint light, the markings of an ancient and technologically advanced civilization. The holographic display in the center of the room projected the Althean homeworld, a network of cities and vast, barren landscapes. It was a place where their cultural pride and their military might were woven into every aspect of their society, but Holt knew this was more than just a display of power, it was a statement. As he sat across from Varia, Nissa, and Lyria, the three women who had already made their mark on him in ways he didn't fully understand, he knew this meeting was unlike anything he had ever experienced. This wasn't a typical diplomatic negotiation, it was something far more intricate, where power was not just political but deeply personal. "Sergeant Holt," Varia began, her voice cutting through the silence with a smooth, controlled tone. "We have invited you here today to discuss the terms of our future alliance. But before we proceed, it is important that we understand where we stand with one another, beyond the formalities." Holt's stomach tightened. The subtle undertone in her words didn't escape him. There was an implicit expectation, an unspoken challenge, that he had yet to meet. The Altheans had always been wary of outsiders, especially humans. Their species had advanced far beyond the primitive, war-torn history of humanity. To them, peace was not a simple matter of diplomacy, it was a balance of power, of mutual respect, and most importantly, trust. Trust, however, was something that was not easily earned, especially in the face of cultural differences that ran as deep as those between humanity and the Altheans. Varia leaned forward slightly, her violet eyes locking with Holt's. "You have seen how we live, Sergeant. You have slept among us, shared our space. But we must ask, can you truly understand us? Can you comprehend what it means to be Althean?" Holt straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening. The question was one he had anticipated, but he hadn't expected it to come so directly. He had been briefed on the Altheans, but there was nothing in the reports that could prepare him for the depth of their culture. Nothing that could explain the sense of alienness that seeped into every interaction, every glance exchanged between the women around him. "I'm here to understand," Holt replied carefully, choosing his words with the same precision he would in any high-stakes negotiation. "I'm here to ensure that humanity's future is secured through mutual cooperation." Varia's lips curled into a slight smile. A noble sentiment. But cooperation is not built on words alone. It is built on shared experiences, on vulnerability, on closeness. And you, Sergeant Holt, have been placed in the most intimate of positions. You sleep in our bed, live in our space. It is an act of trust. But can you truly accept what it means? Holt's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time since his arrival, he felt the weight of the situation press against him like a physical force. The Althean women were not just testing him, they were inviting him into their lives, their culture, in a way that went far beyond mere diplomacy. Their customs, their way of life, were centered on unity, on collective strength, and on shared physical space. To them, being forced to share a bed wasn't just an obligation, it was an offering of trust. "Trust is a delicate thing," Holt said carefully. "But it's not something you give away freely. It's something you earn. And I'm here to prove that humanity can be trusted." A brief silence fell over the room, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Varia seemed to consider his words before nodding slowly. "Perhaps," she said, her voice softer now, but still carrying that commanding undertone. "Perhaps you are correct, Sergeant. But trust, in our world, is not earned in the same way it is on Earth. Here we have learned that strength lies in unity, in the willingness to share, to expose yourself. It is not a question of trust in your actions alone, but in your willingness to break down the barriers that separate you from us. Holt's mind raced, trying to grasp the full weight of her words. The Altheans were not just asking for his cooperation, they were asking for his vulnerability, his willingness to expose himself in ways that went against everything he had been taught. Humanity had always been a species of boundaries, of walls built around emotion and personal space. The Altheans, however, had no such walls. Their very existence was built on openness, on trust through shared physical space, on intimacy. For them, to be close was to be strong, and to be distant was a sign of weakness. The intensity of Viria's gaze made it clear she expected an answer, but Holt wasn't sure how to respond. His mind struggled to reconcile the way his body and emotions were reacting to the Altheans with the mission he had been sent to complete. Before he could speak, Nissa, sitting to Viria's right, leaned forward, her voice laced with curiosity. "You humans," Nissa said, her tone playful but sharp, "are so contained. So stiff. Why is that? Are you afraid of connection? A feeling?" Holt looked over at her, his brows furrowing. "No, I'm not afraid. It's just that." He stopped himself, unsure of how to articulate what felt like an insurmountable divide between their cultures. "Just what?" Lyria, sitting to Viria's left, asked, her voice even softer but no less piercing. "You cannot avoid the truth of what we offer. You cannot pretend to be blind to it, not anymore. You are here because we wanted you here. Not as an outsider but as someone who can see what we are. Who can understand us, even in ways you didn't expect." The words hit Holt harder than he anticipated. He hadn't been prepared for this level of openness, this level of personal engagement. His instincts told him to retreat, to protect himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the Altheans were right. They were offering something genuine, a chance for humanity to be a part of their world, to learn and grow alongside them. But the price of that offer was steep, requiring him to break down barriers he hadn't even realized he had built. "Perhaps you're right," Holt said quietly. "Perhaps there's more to this than I realized. But I still don't understand everything. I still need time." Viria regarded him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Time, yes. But not too much time, Sergeant. There is only so much that can be understood from a distance. We will not wait forever for you to come to us. If you wish to lead humanity into this new era, you must take that first step. You must trust us as we have trusted you." The room grew quiet as her words hung in the air. Holt's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, duty, responsibility, and an unsettling curiosity about these powerful, enigmatic beings. He was far from ready to let go of his reservations, but there was no denying that the Altheans were pushing him to rethink everything he thought he knew about diplomacy, about trust, and about what it truly meant to be human. And as Viria stood, signaling the end of the meeting, Holt realized that the negotiation was no longer just about politics. It was about him and the walls he had spent his entire life building. Would he tear them down, or would he walk away, leaving this world of unfamiliar intimacy behind? The choice was his. But it was no longer as simple as it seemed. A night of tension ***. The council meeting had ended, but the weight of the discussion hung over Sergeant Elias Holt like a thick fog. He had thought he'd prepared himself for the complexities of interspecies diplomacy, but nothing had quite prepared him for the subtle intensity of the Althean culture. The words of Viria, Nissa, and Lyria echoed in his mind as he walked back to the quarters where he was staying, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty hallways of the Althean embassy. Their demands were clear: trust, vulnerability, connection. And the longer he stayed in their presence, the more it became apparent that their understanding of these concepts was fundamentally different from his own. The walls of personal space he had so carefully built throughout his life had no place in their world. He was expected to tear them down, to meet them halfway, physically, emotionally, and mentally. The night air outside the embassy was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of the alien city with it, a mixture of ozone, stone, and something faintly floral. Holt could see the towering structures of Althean architecture in the distance, their spires stretching high into the dark sky. There was something oddly beautiful about the way the city seemed to glow against the backdrop of the barren desert landscape, a stark reminder that civilization had managed to flourish in a place where nothing should have thrived. As he entered the room where he would sleep, the sight that greeted him was the same as it had been the previous night. A large, expansive bed that was more like a small arena than a place for rest. Viria, Nissa, and Lyria were already there, their lithe bodies cloaked in flowing garments that barely concealed the strong, defined muscles of their forms. The space between them was minimal, as though they had long since become accustomed to their proximity. It was an alien thing, this closeness, this unspoken bond of sharing a physical space without hesitation. Holt's discomfort was palpable. He had grown up in a world where privacy was sacred, where even the most basic forms of intimacy were guarded, restrained. The thought of sleeping in the same bed with these women, these towering, beautiful, and impossibly strong beings, felt like a violation of everything he knew. Yet, as much as he wanted to retreat to the comfort of his old habits, there was no denying the pressure that lay upon him. The mission demanded his cooperation, and the Altheans were not interested in half measures. Viria turned to him as he entered, her piercing violet eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him freeze. "You hesitate," she said, her voice calm but carrying an underlying edge. "It is a simple thing, Sergeant Holt. To rest beside us. To share space." Holt swallowed hard, his throat dry. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice betraying the unease he felt. "You're asking me to do something I'm not used to. Something that goes against everything I've been trained for." Viria smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it, only the cool confidence of someone who was used to commanding the room. "Then perhaps you need to understand that this is not about your training. It's about what we can offer you and what you can offer in return. There is strength in unity, Sergeant. Strength in closeness. But you will never experience it if you insist on remaining distant." Holt couldn't argue with her logic, not directly. But the idea of breaking down the walls that had protected him for so long felt impossible. He wasn't sure he was ready for what that would mean, for him, for humanity, for the Alliance. And yet, here he was, trapped in a situation where his personal discomfort was secondary to the greater mission at hand. Without another word, Holt moved toward the bed, his movements stiff and unnatural. Viria gestured for him to sit, and he did, though he felt every ounce of tension in his body. The three women settled in around him, their bodies radiating warmth in the otherwise chilly room. Nissa and Lyria sat on either side of him, while Viria positioned herself at the foot of the bed, her eyes never leaving him. The silence between them was thick, oppressive. It was then that Holt realized something. Despite the overwhelming presence of the Altheans, there was a quiet, almost intimate quality to the stillness between them. The closeness was not an intrusion, but a subtle invitation. It was a challenge, one that required him to let go of his resistance. To be human was to be divided, to cling to individuality, but to be Althean was to exist as part of something greater. A collective, an unspoken unity that transcended the physical. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Should he continue to resist, to uphold the values of his species, or should he take the risk and let go of the discomfort to truly embrace the moment? The mission demanded cooperation. The success of the Alliance required understanding, and to understand the Altheans he needed to immerse himself in their world, their customs. But even as he tried to reason with himself, the reality of the situation remained. He was sharing a bed not just with anyone but with these powerful women, each of them a living, breathing testament to the strength of the Althean species. His own vulnerability was on display in ways he couldn't hide, and the awareness of that made him feel small, exposed. Lyria's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "You are tense, human. You think too much," she said, her tone light but firm. "You must relax. It is simple, really. We have offered you this space. You should accept it not as a task but as a gift." Holt turned to her, meeting her gaze. There was no malice in her words, no mockery. Just a quiet understanding of the gap between them, an acknowledgement that he was trying, even if he didn't know how. "You're right," Holt said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm overthinking it. It's just difficult." Viria's eyes softened slightly as she leaned forward, her presence still commanding. "Difficult, yes. But it is through the difficult things that we grow, Sergeant. You will never truly understand us if you cling to your fears." With that, Viria reached out, her hand brushing lightly against his shoulder in a gesture that felt both reassuring and oddly intimate. The touch sent a jolt through him, and for a moment he forgot to breathe. Her warmth was undeniable, and despite his initial instinct to pull away, he found himself still, frozen in place. The space between them was small now, the bed's expanse no longer a vast chasm but something more manageable, more human. "You do not have to understand everything at once," Viria said gently, her voice now taking on a more soothing quality. "We will give you time. But you must trust that the path ahead will only grow clearer when you begin to open yourself to us." The words struck Holt harder than he expected. They weren't just about the Altheans, about this mission. They were about him, his walls, his reluctance, his isolation. They were asking him to be something he hadn't been trained to be, vulnerable. and for the first time Holt felt the weight of that challenge press against him. He closed his eyes, willing himself to let go of the tension, to let the Altheans in, not entirely but just enough to let them see the person behind the uniform. It was a small step, but it was all he could manage. The night passed slowly. Holt didn't sleep much, but he stayed still, the warmth of the 3 Althean women around him serving as an odd comfort. He wasn't sure if it was the beginning of understanding or just the start of his own unraveling, but one thing was certain. The mission had just become far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. Testing boundaries ***. Morning arrived quietly, the light streaming in through the high, arched windows of the Althean chamber. Holt awoke to find himself still lying between Viria, Nissa, and Lyria. His muscles ached from the tension of the previous night, but when he moved, he realized that the discomfort wasn't solely physical. It was deeper, more complicated, a lingering sense of unease that he couldn't shake. The Althean women were already awake, their bodies still and relaxed, as though they had never felt a fraction of the tension that had gripped him. They had been fully at ease with the closeness, while he had been battling every instinct his human mind had to protect its sense of personal space. As Holt lay there, unsure of how to proceed, Viria's voice broke the silence. "You were awake long before the light came. I could feel your restlessness." Holt's chest tightened. He was sure his discomfort had been apparent, but he didn't expect to be called out so bluntly. He cleared his throat and adjusted himself, sitting up slightly. "I didn't sleep well?" Nissa's laugh rang out softly beside him. It was not mocking but rather a knowing sound. "You are too guarded, human," she said. "You cannot fully rest if you refuse to let go. Your mind is in chains." The words were sharp, cutting, and yet there was no malice behind them. They weren't insulting him. They were observing him, noticing things that even he hadn't realized about himself. The Altheans were not just strangers in his world, they were perceptive, almost unnervingly so. Holt ran a hand through his hair, trying to clear the fog of sleep and uncertainty. "I don't know how to let go. I'm not used to this." He motioned vaguely between them, trying to express the overwhelming closeness that he still hadn't come to terms with. It wasn't just the physical proximity, it was the way they seemed to exist in a constant state of openness, as though every part of them was laid bare. Lyria turned her head toward him, her green eyes soft but direct. "You still believe that privacy, space, is something to be guarded, something to protect from others. But what if we told you it's not something that should be hidden? What if your discomfort is only the result of a false belief?" Holt stared at her, unsure how to respond. What they were offering was nothing like anything he had ever known. Privacy was sacred to him. His personal boundaries, built up over years of military training and discipline, had been a fortress. And now, the very core of those beliefs was being questioned by beings who seemed to have no need for walls or shields. Viria's voice interrupted his thoughts, firm but gentle. "The time for hesitation is over, Sergeant Holt. You are here because we believe you are ready for more than what you understand. This is not a test of willpower or restraint, it is a test of your ability to adapt. To grow." Holt's heart raced as the words sunk in. The weight of the mission and the expectations of his superiors loomed over him, but there was something deeper at play now, something that wasn't just about politics or strategy. This was about him, about his ability to evolve. And that terrified him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "Ready for more?" Holt echoed, his voice rough. "What exactly does that mean? What are you asking of me?" Viria's eyes softened slightly. "We are asking for you to challenge yourself. To challenge everything you've been taught about control, distance, and what it means to connect. Our culture is not built on the separation you cling to. It is built on unity, on trust, and on sharing. Can you accept that, Sergeant?" He swallowed hard. The words were simple, but the implications were immense. Could he truly let go of everything that made him human, or at least everything he had always considered essential to his humanity? Before he could respond, Lyria spoke up again, her tone more playful now, but still carrying that same unyielding directness. "We've already shared a bed with you, Sergeant Holt. Do you think it's just about proximity? Or is there something more you've yet to realize? Every night we share space. But there is no true closeness unless you stop fearing it." Holt's chest tightened. There was again the challenge. The question that he had been trying to avoid. Could he let go of his fear of losing himself in this? Could he surrender to the connection they were asking for? He looked at the 3 women, each one strong, confident, and unervingly open. Viria, with her regal poise. Nissa, who seemed to see through him. Lyria, whose playful demeanor only hid the sharp intelligence beneath. Together, they represented a culture that was everything he wasn't. They didn't just seek unity, they lived it. They were all parts of something greater, and the moment he stepped into their world, he had become part of that greater whole. But did he want to be? Give it time, Virya said as if reading his mind. Let the walls fall slowly. We will not force you. But we will not wait forever. Holt didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood and walked to the edge of the room, staring out at the alien landscape. He had always prided himself on his control, his ability to keep a cool head in any situation. But here, with the Altheans, he felt as though he was being pulled in 1,000 different directions. Their culture, their way of being, was completely foreign to him. And yet, in some inexplicable way, it called to him. What if I can't do it? He asked, turning back to face them. What if I can't let go? Nissa leaned forward slightly, her gaze soft but piercing. Then we will wait for you. But understand this, waiting is not the same as denying. To wait is to acknowledge that the change is possible. It is up to you to decide if you will let it happen. The room fell silent, and for a moment, Holt allowed himself to sink into the words. The weight of his decision seemed almost unbearable. But there was also something liberating about it. For the first time in his life, he was being given a chance to evolve in a way he never thought possible. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with unknowns, but the opportunity was undeniable. He looked at the three women again. They weren't just asking for him to share a bed or a room, they were asking him to share something deeper, something more profound. The question wasn't about whether he could share space with them, but whether he could share his vulnerability, his fears, and ultimately his trust. With a deep breath, Holt stepped back from the window and approached the bed. The tension in his chest hadn't disappeared, but it had lessened. The walls inside him had begun to crack, and though he wasn't sure if he was ready to let them fall completely, he knew he couldn't keep fighting the current. The Altheans had invited him to experience their world, their way of life, and the only way he could do that was to meet them halfway. Virya's eyes followed him as he sat down once more, her gaze filled with quiet approval. You are learning, she said softly, the edges of her lips curving ever so slightly. And that is all we ask. Holt nodded, his throat tight. For the first time he realized that his journey with the Altheans wasn't just about understanding them, it was about understanding himself. And that was far more terrifying than anything he had anticipated. Unspoken bonds ***. Days began to bleed into one another as Holt continued to adapt to the Altheans' way of life. The walls he had spent years constructing around his emotions and his personal space began to feel more like an inconvenience than a safeguard. The women, Virya, Nissa, and Lyria, had been patient, but the silence between them had gradually shifted, growing into something more charged, more subtle. They no longer simply watched him as he struggled. They guided him, each in their own way, pushing him forward, pulling him closer to a version of himself he had never dared to entertain. Despite his best efforts to resist, Holt was beginning to understand their ways. They did not just communicate with words, they spoke through actions, through presence, through silence. They shared their thoughts, their fears, their desires, and in turn, expected the same from him. At first, the idea of being so open, so vulnerable, had terrified him. But now, he was starting to see that it was less about revealing oneself and more about sharing. The Altheans didn't expect him to bare his soul all at once. They only wanted him to trust that he could, in time. That evening, after another long day spent in close quarters with Virya and the others, Holt found himself sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands gripping the blanket tightly. They had been discussing the nature of the alliance between humanity and the Altheans, the terms of cooperation, the potential risks, but as the conversation wound down, Holt noticed something different. The air was thick, heavy, not with tension but with expectation. The subtle changes in their behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. The way Nissa looked at him, the way Lyria seemed to be just a little too close at times, it was all leading to something. We have been patient, Sergeant Holt. Virya's voice was quiet but steady. You've made progress, yes, but there is one final test. Not of your mind, but of your spirit. Holt's heart skipped a beat. A test? Of his spirit? What did that even mean? He turned toward her, a look of confusion creeping across his face. What do you mean? Lyria spoke next, her voice light, but there was a fire in her eyes. You've allowed us to break down your walls, Holt. You've let us in little by little. But you still hold something back. There's a part of you we haven't touched yet. And we intend to touch it. Holt frowned. He could feel his pulse quicken, his throat dry. I don't. Nissa cut him off, her voice low, almost soothing. You can lie to yourself all you want, but your body speaks louder than your words. You're afraid, Sergeant. Afraid of being completely seen. Afraid of the bond we've been asking for. The words hit him like a physical blow. They were right. The walls he had allowed to crumble, had he really let go of everything? No, not entirely. There was still something deep inside him, an instinct to guard the most vulnerable parts of himself, the parts that had once been his greatest weaknesses. His emotions. His need for control. Viria stood up slowly, her presence commanding yet calming. She crossed the room toward him, and for the first time since their arrival, Holt didn't shrink away. Her violet eyes were piercing, but there was no judgment in them. Only understanding. You still see yourself as separate, Sergeant. You still believe you can control what happens between us. But you are wrong. The bond we speak of is not something you control. It is something you surrender to. Holt's throat tightened. I can't just surrender. No, Viria agreed, her voice soft now, almost gentle. You can't. Not until you understand that surrender does not mean weakness. It is not about losing yourself. It is about sharing. Giving of yourself without fear of what might be taken from you. The silence that followed felt deafening. Holt shifted on the bed, trying to make sense of what she was saying. It was one thing to share space, to share a bed, but this was something entirely different. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Lyria, ever perceptive, leaned forward, her gaze searching. But you are ready, aren't you? We have already shared so much, Sergeant Holt. And now it is time for you to take the final step. Holt's breath caught in his chest. The final step. What was that supposed to mean? Was this the moment where he would finally have to confront what he feared the most? To let go of his carefully constructed sense of self? To fully embrace the connection they were offering him? It was a terrifying thought. But as he looked at them, Viria, Nissa, Lyria, he realized something. They weren't asking him to erase who he was. They were asking him to be more. To be something greater than just the sum of his parts. To be part of something larger than the confines of his own humanity. He could feel the pull between them, a magnetic force that drew him in, an energy he couldn't ignore. They had been patient with him, but they had never been naive. They knew that trust, real trust, wasn't just a mental exercise, it was something that happened when two beings connected on a deeper level. And Holt had felt that connection every time they shared space, every time they spoke, every time he allowed his walls to come down just a little more. Without thinking, he stood, his movements slow but deliberate. The room was thick with the weight of the moment, and Holt felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting. He wasn't just standing in their presence, he was standing at the precipice of something profound, something that could change him forever. I'm not sure I understand, Holt said, his voice rough, filled with uncertainty. But I'm willing to try. The quiet that followed was not filled with judgment, but with approval. Viria nodded, the ghost of a smile on her lips. That is enough. And then, without warning, she closed the distance between them. Her hand reached out, gently brushing his arm, sending a ripple of warmth through his body. It wasn't a touch of intimacy, not yet. But it was a touch of understanding. A silent agreement that this, whatever it was a step they would take together. Nissa and Lyria joined them, their presence solidifying the moment, forming a triangle of unity that felt almost sacred. Holt's heart raced, but it wasn't fear that gripped him now. It was anticipation. The same sense of purpose he had once felt in battle, but now directed at something completely different. A battle of the spirit, of trust, of connection. Holt closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, his gaze met Viria's. I'm ready, he said, the words steady, sure. The smallest of smiles appeared on Viria's lips. Then it begins? Without further explanation, the three women slowly encircled him. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls becoming less of a barrier and more of a space to be shared. There were no words now. Only actions. Only the silent understanding that had been building between them, the connection that was now impossible to ignore. Holt felt something stir deep inside him, a realization that he was not alone in this. He wasn't just sharing a room with three Althean women. He was sharing himself too. His walls weren't completely gone, but they were weaker now, and that was enough. He could trust. He could share. He could let go. And as the night stretched on, Holt allowed himself to fall into that surrender. Into the unspoken bond that had been forming between them all along. For the first time he didn't feel so alone. The depths of connection ****. The days following Holt's tentative surrender to the Altheans were unlike any he had experienced. There was a subtle shift in the air, a quiet understanding between him and the three women that could not be ignored. It wasn't as if the world had changed overnight, but Holt had changed. And so had his relationship with them. Viria, Nissa, and Lyria were no longer just his guides or his companions in this strange alien world. They were something more, a reflection of parts of himself that he had never dared to confront. In their presence he had learned not just how to share space, but how to share his fears, his vulnerabilities, and ultimately his trust. But as the days passed, the weight of their closeness began to deepen. The tension that had once been an overwhelming force began to dissolve into something different, something intangible. It was as if they were no longer simply existing in proximity to one another. They were becoming one, woven together in a way that defied explanation. One evening, after a long day spent in the council chambers discussing the Human-Althean alliance, Holt found himself back in their shared quarters. The three women had been quieter than usual, their eyes distant as if they were lost in their thoughts. Holt couldn't help but notice the shift. There was an underlying tension now, something that hadn't been there before. A kind of stillness that made the air feel thick with anticipation. He sat down on the bed, his muscles sore from the day's work, but his mind was elsewhere. He could feel their presence around him, but it wasn't oppressive. It was almost comforting, like a blanket of warmth and strength that wrapped around him. Viria's voice broke the silence, her words soft but insistent. "You are changing, Sergeant Holt. I can see it in your eyes." Holt turned to her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" Nissa, who had been standing by the window, turned around, her dark eyes glinting with a mixture of understanding and something deeper, something almost predatory. "The walls you built for yourself are crumbling. Slowly but surely. You no longer hide from us as you once did. You no longer try to control everything." Lyria, who had been sitting beside him, reached out to touch his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "It's not just your mind that's changing, Holt. It's your heart. Your spirit. You are letting us in, not just physically but emotionally. You are beginning to understand what it means to truly connect." Holt felt a knot form in his stomach, but it wasn't fear. It was something else, something unfamiliar. He had come to understand that the Altheans didn't simply seek his cooperation. They sought his transformation. They wanted him to change, not for their benefit but for his own. And that was something Holt had never been asked to do before. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't know how to do this. How do I let go of everything I've known? How do I stop controlling everything?" The three women exchanged a look, and for a moment, Holt wondered if they were speaking a language he couldn't understand. But then Viria's voice, calm and steady, answered him. "You are afraid, Sergeant. Afraid of the unknown. Afraid that in letting go you will lose yourself. But what you don't understand is that in surrendering to the bond, in truly letting go, you will find yourself. You will become something greater than the man who walked through that door." Holt looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust that the Altheans weren't just playing some kind of game, that they truly believed in him, in his ability to change. But there was still a part of him, the human part, that resisted. The part of him that needed to maintain control. The part that couldn't fathom giving in completely. Lyria leaned closer, her voice low, almost intimate. "It's not about losing yourself, Holt. It's about expanding your capacity to feel, to connect. You've spent so much time building walls, you've forgotten what it's like to just be. To exist without fear, without the need to control." Her words sent a ripple through him, like the faintest touch of a breeze on a hot day. He had always believed that control was what kept him grounded. But now, with the Altheans, he was beginning to understand that control could also be a cage. A prison of his own making. The fear of losing himself had kept him locked in that cage for so long. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way out. Nissa moved toward him, her eyes burning with intensity. "Let go, Holt. Let go of the fear. Trust us, trust yourself. We have shared everything with you, our space, our minds, our hearts. You are not alone in this. You are one of us now." Her words cut through the fog in his mind, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Holt stopped fighting. He stopped resisting. He stopped trying to control the overwhelming flood of emotions that had been building inside him ever since he stepped foot on Althea. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the bond. The connection. With a deep breath, Holt closed his eyes. He could feel the presence of the Altheans around him, the warmth of their bodies, the strength of their spirits. They were there, not just physically but emotionally. He could feel the depth of their connection to him, and for the first time he didn't shy away from it. He let himself feel it. Every sensation, every emotion, every subtle shift in the air. When he opened his eyes again, the three women were standing around him, their gazes unwavering, their bodies close. It wasn't just a shared space anymore. It was something more, a shared experience, a shared understanding. A bond that transcended words. Viria's voice was soft but firm. "Do you understand now, Sergeant?" Holt nodded, his throat tight. I think I do." He had always prided himself on his ability to control the situation, to dictate the terms of his interactions. But now, for the first time in his life, he was learning that true power didn't lie in control. It lay in trust, in vulnerability, in connection. Lyria smiled, her eyes gleaming with pride. Good. The path you are walking is not an easy one, but it is the only path worth taking. Now we can truly be one. Nissa reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek in a gesture of intimacy that went far beyond physical touch. We have waited for you, Holt. And now that you have joined us, we will walk this path together. The words hung in the air, and Holt felt the weight of them, the truth of them settling deep within him. He wasn't just a human soldier anymore. He was part of something greater, a connection that bound him to the Altheans in ways he could barely comprehend, but was starting to understand. And as the night stretched on, he felt the full force of that connection. It wasn't just about sharing a room, a bed, or a mission. It was about sharing lives, sharing hearts, sharing a future. In that moment, Holt realized that the fear of losing himself had been replaced by something far greater, the desire to find himself. To find a new version of himself, one that was more than just human, more than just the soldier he had been. He was becoming something more. And that was just the beginning. The path forward ***. The quiet after the shared moment of revelation felt different. Holt could feel the Althean's presence around him, but it wasn't oppressive. It was a subtle pulse, like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. He no longer felt like a lone human on a foreign world, a soldier isolated by his own need for control. He had become part of something greater, something profound. The tension that had once defined his interactions with Viria, Nissa, and Lyria had faded into a deep, mutual understanding. There was no longer a need for walls between them. They had shared more than just space, more than just their bodies. They had shared their essence, their trust. And in doing so, they had formed a bond that felt both ancient and entirely new. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Holt was beginning to understand the Altheans' way of existing, of being together. It was a quiet form of strength, a way of sharing everything without forcing or demanding. They didn't need to speak constantly. Their presence alone was enough to communicate everything that needed to be said. Viria was the first to break the silence, her voice soft but resonant. There is much more for you to learn, Sergeant. This bond, it is not something that can be fully understood in a single moment. But you are no longer the man who entered this room days ago. Holt nodded, still processing the enormity of everything that had happened since he arrived on Althea. He had come as an outsider, a soldier with a mission, carrying with him all the prejudices and fears of his own world. He had been sent to secure an alliance, but in doing so he had found something far greater, something that transcended diplomacy, something that was more profound than the strategic value of an alliance. He had found family. He had found home. I never imagined, Holt's voice faltered, the words stuck in his throat. I never imagined I would come to feel this way, to be part of something like this. Lyria, ever the empath, smiled gently. No one does, Holt. But that is the beauty of it. When you let go of fear, when you stop trying to control every aspect of your life, you discover a world far bigger than the one you thought you knew. Nissa stepped forward, her expression serious, yet there was warmth in her eyes. You are not just part of this alliance now. You are part of us, a part of our future. And that future is something we will build together. The weight of her words hung in the air, but Holt felt no fear. Instead, a sense of peace settled over him. He had been afraid of the future, of losing himself in the process of becoming something different. But now, with the Altheans, he understood that his future wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced. The unknown wasn't an abyss, it was a vast landscape full of possibilities. A place to grow, to discover, to evolve. But there were still things left unsaid, questions that lingered in the back of his mind. There were still parts of the equation that weren't fully clear. Holt turned his gaze to Viria, who had been quietly observing him. What happens now? What does this mean for all of us? Viria's smile was faint, but there was a deep wisdom in her eyes. It means that you have found a place here, Holt. Not just in this room but in our world. We are preparing for a new chapter, one that requires trust, unity, and understanding. Humanity's place among the stars is not yet fully defined, and the Altheans need you as much as you need us. The words settled in his mind, and Holt found himself taking a deep breath, the weight of his new reality settling over him. The stakes were higher than ever. The alliance between the Altheans and humanity was no longer just a matter of politics. It was about something much deeper. The future of both their peoples rested on their ability to coexist, to trust each other, to share in a vision that extended far beyond the immediate horizon. "I understand," Holt said, his voice steady, "and I will do everything I can to help. But there's still a lot I don't know. A lot I still need to learn." "You are learning, Sergeant," Viria replied softly. "But you will never stop learning. Not with us." The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt like a shared understanding. Holt was no longer the outsider. He was no longer just a soldier, a pawn in some grand interplanetary game. He was part of something that could change the fate of not just his species, but the Elthians as well. A bond had been forged, a bond that transcended the boundaries of species, of politics, of war. The future was uncertain, but for the first time Holt felt ready to face it. He was not alone in this anymore. He had his place. As the night stretched on, Holt lay down on the bed, his mind still processing the events that had unfolded. His eyes traced the constellations through the window, the stars twinkling in the vastness of space. He had spent so much of his life looking at the stars from a distance, wondering what lay beyond. Now he understood. The stars were not distant objects to be admired from afar. They were part of a much larger tapestry, one that stretched across the universe. A tapestry that he was now a part of. The soft warmth of the Elthians' presence surrounded him, and for the first time, Holt felt no fear of the unknown. He wasn't just part of humanity anymore. He was part of something far greater, a shared existence that stretched across species, across worlds. The bond between them was a force, a living thing, and Holt could feel it pulsing through him deep in his chest. The future, whatever it held, was something they would face together. And as the stars outside shone brightly in the darkness, Holt closed his eyes, knowing that whatever came next, he was no longer alone. He was home. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.